Episode 3. We were United World Federalists back then. I don't know what we are now. Telephoners, I guess. We telephone a lot, or I do anyway, late at night. A couple of weeks after I telephoned my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, I really did go to see him. That must have been in 1964 or so, whatever the last year was for the New York World's Fair. My name is Jan Jönsson. There was a young man from Stamboul. I took 2 little girls with me, my daughter, Nanny, and her best friend, Allison Mitchell. They had never been off Cape Cod before. When we saw a river, we had to stop so they could stand by it and think about it for a while. They had never seen water in that long and narrow, unsalted form before. The river was the Hudson. There were carp in there, and we saw them. They were as big as atomic submarines. We saw waterfalls, too, streams jumping off cliffs into the valley of the Delaware. There were lots of things to stop and see, and then it was time to go. Always time to go. The little girls were wearing white party dresses and black party shoes, so strangers would know at once how nice they were. Time to go, girls, I'd say, and we would go. And the sun went down, and we had supper in an Italian place. And then I knocked on the front door of the beautiful stone house of Bernard V. O'Hare. I was carrying a bottle of Irish whiskey like a dinner bell. I met his nice wife, Mary, to whom I dedicate this book. I dedicate it to Gerhard Mueller, the Dresden taxi driver, too. Mary O'Hare is a trained nurse, which is a lovely thing for a woman to be. Mary admired the 2 little girls I'd brought, mixed them in with her own children, sent them all upstairs to play games and watch television. It was only after the children were gone that I sensed that Mary didn't like me, or didn't like something about the night. She was polite, but chilly. "It's a nice, cozy house you have here," I said, and it really was. "I fixed up a place where you can talk and not be bothered," she said. "Good," I said, and I imagined 2 leather chairs near a fire in a paneled room where 2 old soldiers could drink and talk. But she took us into the kitchen. She had put 2 straight-back chairs at a kitchen table with a white porcelain top. The tabletop was screaming with reflected light from a 200-watt bulb overhead. Mary had prepared an operating room. She put only 1 glass on it, which was for me. She explained that O'Hare couldn't drink the hard stuff since the war. So we sat down. O'Hare was embarrassed, but he wouldn't tell me what was wrong. I couldn't imagine what it was about me that could burn Mary up so. I was a family man. I'd been married only once. I wasn't a drunk. I hadn't done her husband any dirt in the war. She fixed herself a Coca-Cola, made a lot of noise, banging the ice cube tray in the stainless steel sink. Then she went into another part of the house. But she wouldn't sit still. She was moving all over the house, opening and shutting doors, even moving furniture around to work off anger. I asked O'Hare what I'd said or done to make her act that way. "It's all right," he said. "Don't worry about it. It doesn't have anything to do with you." That was kind of him. He was lying. It had everything to do with me. So we tried to ignore Mary and remember the war. I took a couple of belts of the booze I'd brought. We would chuckle or grin sometimes as though war stories were coming back, but neither one of us could remember anything good. O'Hare remembered one guy who got into a lot of wine in Dresden before it was bombed, and we had to take him home in a wheelbarrow. It wasn't much to write a book about. I remembered 2 Russian soldiers who had looted a clock factory. They had a horse-drawn wagon full of clocks. They were happy and drunk. They were smoking huge cigarettes they had rolled in newspaper. That was about it for memories. And Mary was still making noise. She had finally come out into the kitchen again for another Coke. She took another tray of ice cubes from the refrigerator, banged it in the sink, even though there was already plenty of ice out. Then she turned to me, let me see how angry she was, and that the anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she said was a fragment of a much larger conversation.
"You were just babies then," she said.
"What?" I said.
"You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs."
I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood.
"But you're not going to write it that way, are you?"
This wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I don't know, I said.
"Well, I know," she said. "You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in movies by Frank Sinatra and John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And war will look just wonderful, so we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies like the babies upstairs."
So then I understood. It was war that made her so angry. She didn't want her babies or anybody else's babies killed in wars, and she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. So I held up my right hand and I made her a promise. "Mary," I said, "I don't think this book is ever going to be finished. I must have written 5,000 pages by now and thrown them all away. If I ever do finish it, though, I give you my word of honor. There won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. I'll tell you what," I said. "I'll call it the Children's Crusade." She was my friend after that. O'Hare and I gave up on remembering, went into the living room, talked about other things. We became curious about the real Children's Crusade, so O'Hare looked it up in a book he had, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, LL.D. It was first published in London in 1841. Mackay had a low opinion of all crusades. The Children's Crusade struck him as only slightly more sordid than the 10 Crusades for grown-ups. O'Hare read this handsome passage out loud.
"History in her solemn page informs us that the Crusaders were but ignorant and savage men, that their motives were those of bigotry unmitigated, and that their pathway was one of blood and wars. Romance, on the other hand, dilates upon their piety, heroism, and portrays in her most glowing and impassioned hues their virtue and magnanimity, the imperishable honor they acquired for themselves, and the great services they rendered to Christianity."
And then O'Hare read this.
"Now, what was the grand result of all these struggles? Europe expended millions of her treasures and the blood of 2 million of her people, and a handful of quarrelsome knights retained possession of Palestine for about 100 years.
Mackay told us that the Children's Crusade started in 1213, when 2 monks got the idea of raising armies of children in Germany and France and selling them in North Africa as slaves. 30,000 children volunteered, thinking they were going to Palestine.
They were no doubt idle and deserted children who generally swarm in great cities, nurtured on vice and daring," said Mackay, "and ready for anything."
Pope Innocent III thought they were going to Palestine too, and he was thrilled. "These children are awake while we are asleep," he said. Most of the children were shipped out of Marseille, and about half of them drowned in shipwrecks. The other half got to North Africa, where they were sold. through a misunderstanding. Some children reported for duty at Genoa, where no slave ships were waiting. They were fed and sheltered and questioned kindly by good people, then given a little money and a lot of advice and sent back home.
"Hooray for the good people of Genoa,"
said Mary O'Hare.